right, so if you're just joining us or if you're watching this later, my name is Rabia Lewis. I'm here with Dr. Charles S. Finch. He's also my father. He's, for almost 30 or plus years, he's been a renowned author and a public speaker, and he's traveled to Africa almost 50 or more times. 75 times. So he really knows what he's talking about. And some of his books, for example, he's author of Star of Deep Beginnings, The African Background to Medical Science, and Echoes of the Old Dark Land. Afterwards, I'll give you guys, afterwards, hopefully you can check out his website, charlessfinch.com. And if you like and share this session, we can send you a 10% off coupon to his store. So hopefully you guys will be able to share this. But today we're just talking about Pan-Africanism. It's very relevant to what's the issues that are coming up for us today. It's just as relevant as it was in the 1920s or the 1900s really when it started, and it's kind of had a somewhat steady growth, but I think it needs to come back onto the table as we really try to make sense of where blacks and the African diaspora, where we want to move forward. And I definitely want to hear from Dr. Finch about what his thoughts are on it. In addition, Dr. Finch is just getting back from his trip to Ghana, almost a 10-day trip. So he can maybe also give us some of the details from that trip and how it can relate to this discussion on Pan-Africanism. So I want to begin with, some people have an idea of what it is, but what is the definition of Pan-Africanism, so we know that we're all on the same page?
Well, I don't know if it's even possible to be on the same page because, as you have suggested, it has been a concept in evolution, and it doesn't always mean the same things to everybody. The first Pan-Africanists, it is interesting to note, were not from Africa.
Yes.
They were from the diaspora back in the 19th century. Martin Delany, Edward Wilmot Blyden, George Padmore, and W.B. Du Bois. Oh, let's not forget Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois. Whereas you might say the fathers and the pioneers where Pan-Africanism is concerned. You didn't start seeing any African-based Pan-Africanisms until the rise of two individuals. One was Kwame Nkrumah, of course. I just came back from the country that he founded, basically, in 1957. Yes. The first president of Ghana. The first president of a newly independent Ghana, beginning in 1957. And he was a Pan-Africanist. And Nnamdi Ezekwe from Nigeria. Both of whom, by the way, studied at Lincoln University. I have always thought, without any direct proof, that both were Pan-Africanists, and I think living and working and going to school in the diaspora had an influence on that, on their model, their thinking, shall we say. Nkrumah was a very great man, and sort of larger than life, and you really get a sense of that when you visit Ghana. He was deeply and totally committed to the upliftment and the colonial liberation of his own people in Ghana, but really all of the black world on both sides of the Atlantic, and so was Ezekwe. And Du Bois, as many of you might know, had become persona non grata in America. Totally isolated, totally marginalized, totally silenced. And Nkrumah, who admired Du Bois greatly, offered him a sanctuary, so to speak, and invited him to come and live in Ghana. And that's in fact what Du Bois did the last 2 or 3 years of his life. And the idea, by the way, was for Du Bois to supervise the preparation of the Encyclopedia of Africa, an Africa encyclopedia. But he was already 90 when he moved to Ghana and died before that project could really get very much underway. but he became a Ghanaian citizen. In fact, talking about Pan-Africanism, he became a Ghanaian citizen and rejected his U.S. citizenship. He didn't have to. You can go to, found that out on my recent trip to Ghana. You can take out dual citizenship, and many have. That's one thing about Ghana. Of all the sub-Saharan African countries, it is the one country that seems to be most congenial to African Americans and Africans in diaspora to move to, visit, and even to move to. There's a noticeable African American originating community there in Ghana. Now, what is Pan-Africanism? Well, I think it just speaks for itself. Pan means all. It means the sense that all African people can and should be united. All right. And oh, by the way, you can imagine Bob Marley is kind of an icon there in Ghana, and especially his song "Africa Unite." Heard that a lot, and so there's a sense that so it's a simple yet complex concept that Africans must, in fact, unite. The three individuals to me that I think have had the most impact on that way of thinking, who are from Africa itself, was I've already mentioned two of them, Kwame Nkrumah, and the other Nnamdi Nzikwe from Nigeria, and the third one is actually Sheikh Anta Diop from Senegal. And all of them, shall we say, suffered for their beliefs. And we know what happened to Nkrumah. Nkrumah in 1966 was overthrown, really by an CIA-inspired coup by generals that were, shall we say, what do you want to say, subverted by the CIA. And when he was away in China, I think, when it happened. And he never went back. He was never able to go back to Ghana and died in exile. Sheikh Anta Diop was thrown into jail 4 times, in prison 4 times, by Senghor because of his strong anti-colonialist and Pan-Africanist way of thinking. So, and it's a simple concept in one way, and that is Africans unite. I don't know how else to say it, and that means on both sides of the water. That those icons I've just mentioned thought like that. They thought of Africa as a whole, both in Africa and in the Western Hemisphere, and in that way they were carrying on from the pioneers who. From the 19th and early 20th century, who actually did not even come from Africa. And I have to say this because we have to be honest about ourselves, okay? Even today, there's not a really strong concept of Pan-Africanism among most Africans. They tend to be mostly loyal to their ethnic group and or nation without the overarching sense of the unity of Africa, okay? And in fact, that is, in some ways, it kind of gets them in trouble, you might say. Because I got this sense in this visit, the CIA keeps a close, and the other European secret services keep a close eye on Africa. And whenever a individual starts to rise, who can be, shall we say, a rallying point for Africans, he becomes a target. It's almost invariable. It's inevitable and invariable.
Yeah, just 2 examples of that. Marcus Garvey was a big, in many ways, he was a black nationalist, but you could also call him a Pan-Africanist. In some ways, he was definitely targeted in his movement with going back to Africa and starting an independent African diasporic nation and state. It was kind of revolutionary for the time. He didn't get very much support in his native country of Jamaica, but he got a lot of momentum here in the United States. But the Black Star Line, it was getting there, and then no one knows exactly what happened. But the idea is that the American intelligence agencies got involved and kind of made that.
Deconstructed it.
Exactly.
Deconstructed his movement. And it was called the Black Star Line. He had 1 million followers, or at least 1 million people who
coming on.
He had 1 million people who were ready really to go back to Africa with them, okay? And Garvey, therefore, could be considered, again, one of the fathers of modern Pan-Africanism. It's interesting. Garvey had an impact on Nkrumah. I should mention that. How do we know this? Because if you look at the Ghanaian flag, we don't have a picture of it, right in the middle, I think their colors are red, green, and yellow. But right in the middle of that flag is the black star. And that derives directly from Garvey's Black Star line. So yeah, you can say, without too much fear of contradiction, that he was one of those founding Pan-Africanist fathers, I suppose is the word, in the early 20th century. So there has been a kind of a pedigree. Pan-Africanism has had to survive against, shall we say, a lot of indifference. Is that the word? And yet it has survived. And even when it seems like it is fading from view, there comes a time when events in the world and individuals kind of bring it back into public consciousness, at least in the black world. So that Pan-Africanism, and so there is a continuing, ongoing Pan-Africanist feeling and sense.
Yeah. At one point, Garvey had 2 million.
I said 1 million, but it could have been 2 million.
That was what signed up for the Black Star Line. The
That's
2 million Black American followers in the 1920s. So you can imagine the fervor, and he taught to be proud of yourself, to be proud of your African heritage, to be proud of your African features. He was teaching that, and he was getting so much momentum behind that in the 1920s. And it seems like, okay, it's like we have to restart that momentum, and that's kind of starting to build now. But and I kind of wanted to touch on also, even just when you said they're being targeted and they're being watched. I know. Just not. I mean, it's definitely history at this point. But Gaddafi, as much flack as he got in our American media, I know one of his agendas was uniting Africa economically, and lo and behold, he got taken out by by United States as well, and he's considered one of the enemies of the state. So we have to kind of keep that in mind when we're even talking about that. Like, what are we willing to, expose ourselves to? You have to keep in mind what we're up against when we're talking about Pan-Africanism. But there's two parts to it. Also, as you brought up, there's the African solidarity, uniting economically and politically and becoming independent of the ex-colonial powers. And so there's that part, but there's also the African diaspora and how can we connect and empower each other and draw strength from each other, from a common history, from shared experiences, even though they're not always identical, and how that unites us in a common destiny and a future. So those are kind of the two aspects to it. I think one of the least controversial of the two, unfortunately, is the latter that I was just explaining, was just us coming together in terms of our thought process as far as motion forward. Where do we all come together on this? What would you say about America in particular, and African Americans, or Black Americans as some people like to be referred to now as? How do you think that this movement, how should we embrace it, and how should we be looking at it, and what are some things we could start doing and thinking? You
got to be careful. I won't say be careful. Maybe that's not the word, but you've got to understand. You start talking about Pan-Africanism in a public way, let alone start organizing, you're going to set forces in motion against you, all right? From the highest levels.
Said the volume is low, so it makes
Sorry. From the highest levels. That's not a reason not to move forward, but realize that you are going to face the same kind of pushback, I guess is the word, that all these other Pan-Africanist pioneers experience. Now, the thing is, we often like to think of, liberation, empowerment, black empowerment, as happening in our lifetimes. That's one thing I let go of that concept a long time ago. I let go of that concept a long time ago, and I started reorienting my thinking in terms of a 500-year process. And I even say this to people. I say, if you're not willing to put 500 years into it, then don't even get started. Don't even bother. You're not going to solve it. You're not going to take care of this in your lifetime or even in this century. And it's not just the external enemy that we could talk about, all right? the CIA or any of the European secret services or the U.S. government or the dominant population, yeah, those are going to be forces that are going to be arrayed against us. But, and this is a thing that we don't do too much of or not enough of, what are the interior barriers? What are the interior forces that work against us? And let me tell you, they're there. Quite a bit of it is there. Not only here, but also in Africa. All right. Whether, one of the things, I've been going back and forth to Africa 75 times, but I do not take a rose-colored view of what Africa is. That all of Africa is Wakanda. It isn't. All right. There is corruption. There's poverty, of course, and there is corruption, and there is exploitation, and there are those who are in positions of power who work for the colonialists, the neo-colonialists, who are pretty much out of sight, kind of British, French, Dutch, out of sight. One of the things that you, especially in Ghana, you get appreciation for. You think of the English as being the big colonial, the big enslavers and colonialists, but then you go to those slave castles. They're not castles; they're dungeons, and you begin to realize the biggest, the first and biggest, and one of the worst enslavers and instigators of the slave trade was Portugal. Portugal, yes. Others followed in their wake: Spain, the Dutch, very much so, and of course the English and the French after them. All right, because what was the wealth that came out of West Africa? Ghana in particular, but all of West Africa. Big one.
Gold.
Well, even before we get to gold, slaves.
Oh, slaves. Yeah.
The slave trade. And the other thing that you have to face unflinchingly is the African participation in the slave trade. I'm sorry. It happened. There was no other way, because they would go 300 to 400 miles inland to get slaves. Well, the Europeans weren't going to do that. They had to have African partners. And what they did, they managed to stimulate or foment rivalry, the incipient ethnic rivalries between various groups, playing one off against the other, giving guns to one and withholding guns from the other in order to get those slaves. And those slaves and there was an insatiable appetite for slaves in the plantation economies in Northern and South America. Now, let me just give you a horrendous statistic. And there were horrors that we saw recently in those slave dungeons. If you talk about those slaves that were taken from the interior, by the time they were marched, barefoot, by the way, barefoot and half naked, 300 miles south to the coast, 35% of them died died, okay? Then another 5 or 10% died in the dungeons because of conditions, horrendous conditions. And then another 30, and then if you talk about those who actually got on the boats or put on the boats and sent over to the Americas, 30% of those died and were thrown into the ocean. So the attrition rate was horrible, and yet there was an insatiable demand for slaves all the way up, even after the, what do you want to call it, when Britain and then Holland outlawed the slave trade in 1807 and then 1810, there was contraband. In other words, ships continued to come to Africa and get slaves and take them to the New World, even though the British had outlawed it. All right. So that continued, and then slavery was not abolished in Brazil. If you're talking about the diaspora, talking about the Americas, the slavery was not abolished until 1888 in Brazil, and I think it was 1886 in Cuba, and not until 1948 in Saudi Arabia.
Jeez.
And the last country to abolish slavery legally was Mauritania in Africa itself. And there are those who say in some of those North African countries, without knowing it, slavery still exists. All right, and so
got Libya going on.
Libya. So you can begin to you make a trip like we just made, and you can begin to appreciate the enormity of the problem and the realization that okay, you don't wait, you just don't throw up your hands and sort of flush your commitment down the toilet. But you need to be willing to put those 500 years in. And of course, that means that not only those who are consider themselves conscious now about such things, especially about Pan-Africanism, well, I mean, somehow they've got to, what is the word, produce a pedigree, a lineage of individuals who will continue to carry it forward with ever greater strength and commitment and do it right, too. We could talk about how you go about doing it right. But I don't think Pan-Africanism will die. I mean, I think it'll kind of have that sinusoidal wave. There'll be periods where it'll peak in interest and recognition and conversation, and then it'll kind of die down, usually under pressure from above, and it'll peak up again. So you just have to kind of ride the wave. When I say we, over a period of another 4.5 centuries, almost 5 centuries.
So in terms of making it such a huge issue, you can't even put your mind around it a little bit, but making it practical, I can just imagine that we could just start having conversations, not just with ourselves, not just Black Americans, but with African people in America, African people in Africa, with Caribbean people, with people African people of South America, especially the Blacks of Brazil, and just kind of, I think with social media now, like it's easier than ever to reach out to these people and to keep these conversations going. So, like you said, this could be almost a 400 or 500 year process, and but you still want to start. For those who've never been involved, you still want to start somewhere and just kind of participate in the conversation. But not only that, it sounds like you were saying we've got to start indoctrinating our children and our young people to this idea and to this thought that people of African descent do share a destiny. We share something in that there is something to be said about if one of us does well and succeeds, that could trickle down to, or trickle across laterally to all of us in some ways. I think Black Americans and the successes that we have does start to trickle into Latin countries, and sometimes it can empower Africans from African countries. So I do believe in that, and this is part of what I believe, just getting that momentum going in this discussion. I think the movie Black Panther, in its own way, it kind of started the discussion of, okay, so
let's say restarted.
You're right, because this discussion was started in the 1900s, all right, but it kind of started it for the 2000s in a way, to get us starting to think about, okay, our emotions towards Africans and where do we stand and how do we move forward and how can we help each other? Do we, or is it every man for himself?
Well, that's the way of death.
We do appreciate your comments. I know there was an earlier comment about you coming to speak in Bermuda. Yes, okay. He travels to speak, so you would just have to, send us an inquiry, either from his page, any of his pages, your email. What's your email?
Let me email is charlessfinch@gmail.com.
At gmail.com.
Charles S. Finch, one word, lowercase, at gmail.com. Charles S. Finch at gmail.com. I want to say one other thing, because this came up more than once in our recent trip to Ghana. What Africa, like in places like Ghana and throughout Africa, they're suffering from a different kind of, it used to be slaves and gold. Now it's the intellectual capital that's being drained out of Africa. It's
intellectual capital.
Yes, the brain. They're calling it the brain drain.
Of Africa.
They get educated at those colleges and universities in Africa, and what do? They try. Let's just talk about Ghana. The first thing they try to do. So many of them, not all of them, but many, maybe even most of them, is try to get to England, Canada, or the United States. Now, in some saying, I'm not trying to. I'm not trying to just offer a blanket criticism of all of that, because very often they can't find any gainful employment in Ghana. Nonetheless, whatever the reason is, legitimate or not, it is a brain drain out of a country like Ghana and other African countries.
Nigeria as well.
Nigeria.
A lot of the doctors from Nigeria.
The individuals who are best in a position to move African countries forward into the future are the ones who are leaving Africa. And sometimes, and very often, they don't feel like they have any other choice. Now, here's the other thing, and I'm going to say it. I'm at the age now where I don't care. There were too many pictures of a white Jesus throughout Ghana. I've been going to Ghana a lot. Not a lot. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say a lot. I've been about 5 or 6 times. I never saw so much white Jesus as I did this time. All over the place.
You're saying it's starting to transform. Were the pictures different before?
They weren't there before.
Oh,
not to that
interesting.
extent. But I said I couldn't. I couldn't get my mind around that. That white Jesus was everywhere in Ghana, and that's what they're saying is happening. The Christianization of Ghana or in other African countries, is another, shall we say, deleterious effect. Especially since you just can't, it just was very grating to see this white, soft-haired Jesus everywhere you looked. You couldn't get away from him. And I mean, it just shows you the kind of, what do I want to say? The kind of challenges that Africa faces and Ghana faces is multidimensional. There's not one thing you say, well, if we take care of this, everything will fall into place. No, it's got to be addressed from several different angles. And that's, of all the things we talked about, that's one of them.
And they definitely could reimagine Jesus in their own image, and they have it would make the most sense to do that. But you're saying they're not even doing that.
They don't do that. You never saw a brown or a black Jesus anywhere in Ghana. And we traveled all over the country, up to Kumasi, Cape Coast, Accra. Never saw a brown or a black Jesus at all, anywhere. I tell you, it was very disconcerting to me. But.
So I know someone also asked if wanted you to speak on the economic empowerment of Africa, but we can't quite get into that today. But that'll be a topic we would love to just kind of explore more when we do this more often, which we will definitely be doing. You can also leave your comments of what topics you would like Dr. Finch to expound on or to talk about. And leave that in the comments. Again, if you like and share and you go to charlessfinch.com and you go to the store and you want to buy something, we can send you a 10% coupon code. We can send that, message that to your inbox if you do like and share this Facebook Live.
Let me just kind of counteract. No, not counteract. Let me just kind of. It wasn't it's easy to see everything that's wrong with the place, right? Especially go to Africa. But we like Ghana because, interestingly enough, it is maybe, I think I said this earlier, but say it again, it is the one country in Africa that African Americans find themselves most able to fit into. They don't, there's an ease with which they can be in Ghana and even live in Ghana. In spite, like I said, I noticed things that didn't sit right with me. But I mean, I am, after all, coming from the outside looking in. And if anybody comes to America, they could see the same. They could see all the things that are wrong with America from the outside. But we like Ghana, and I think of all of the West African or African countries that I've been to. And I've been to quite a few. It held, you might say, the most promise. Is that the word? At least where I see it now. One of the countries that held a lot of promise, I guess, and especially the one country where, more than any other, where the diasporic Africans and the Africans on the African country can link up, right? Through Nkrumah. And Nkrumah, then that's the other thing I want to say before we finish. And Nkrumah looms very large in Ghana, in the Ghanaian history, in the Ghanaian psyche, you might say. And I think his presidency, though it was cut short, was instrumental, I think, in moving Ghana. It was the first African country to achieve its independence after, in 1957, after the colonial domination. And Nkrumah is was a larger-than-life figure, and we all need to learn a lot more about him. And because he was, like I said, he was one of Africa's great men in the 20th century.
So we had some questions we probably won't be able to get to. Like, for example, someone was asking about the issues of Africa going backwards, or is it going backwards, and how does that relate to?
I would like to answer that, though. It's not. It's not.
Be focused. How do we focus locally? Or?
It's not that simple as saying going backwards and forward. Africa is in ferment, okay, and that is not only understandable but inevitable. Okay.
Say that again.
It's in ferment. I mean, you can't
Ferment.
you can't say that it's going forward, or you can't say it's going backward. Everything is in flux. You see, it's still very much in flux, and that's why I have that feeling that, and I use 2000 as my base year, that we're talking about 500 years, and Ghana certainly can go forward. I felt that right from the very, very beginning. Yeah, there's a lot going on, a lot of trouble and problems. I won't say trouble, problems in Ghana, but shoot, name me some place in the world where there's not problems. And but yet I had this feeling that Ghana could be that country that can take strides and steps that will move it into the future. But let me tell you, if Ghana really starts, and Ghana is actually doing well economically, by the way. It has a growth rate of somewhere between 3 and 5% every year. But if it starts getting too successful, I'm telling you, the CIA will come after it. Believe me, they will.
All right, so we're gonna wrap it up because literally, once you get my dad started, he could go on for hours, and I know you guys want to get on with your evenings, but we'll definitely be back very soon. Definitely leave comments on what issues and topics you would like to hear from Dr. Finch, and we'll be ready to tackle those. But thank you so much for tuning in. Yes, we are going to be doing this regularly. However often my dad says he wants to do it. I know some people who came in late were like, "Oh, who is this?" My name is Rabia Finch Lewis. I'm the daughter of Dr. Finch, and I'm going to be helping him to make sure he does this regularly because I know I'm desperate to hear more of his thoughts, and I think you guys are as well. And I want to also bring more people into introducing who he is to the world. I know some of us been knowing about you from the 80s, but some of us don't even know who you are. So I want to make it my personal mission to bring you out there. So thank you guys again so much for being here with us. Have a wonderful evening.